Kenneth Eugene Parnell was an American convicted sex offender. He was charged with committing heinous crimes, including the kidnapping and the rape of at least 3 different children. In 1952, an unknown victim, 1972, Steven Stayner, and in 1980, Timothy White. He also tried to buy a child, a 4-year-old boy, for $500 in 2003. The time Parnell spent in prison for what he did to the 3 victims in 2 different charges is very short, considering he had a wide criminal record going in and out of jail all his life. Kenneth Eugene Parnell was born on September 26, 1931 in Amarillo, Texas, to Cecil Frederick and Mary Olive Parnell during the region's Dust Bowl era, the period known as the Great Depression. Parnell was raised mostly without his father, who abandoned the whole family when Kenneth was just 6. At a later time of his life, he moved with his mother, his 2 half-sisters, and a half-brother to Bakersfield, California, where his mother operated a boarding lodge. He lived a very unstable life, going in and out of juvenile custody for car theft and arson. Parnell claimed to have been married 3 times, but only 2 instances of his marriage are known. The first was when he married 15-year-old Patsy Jo Dalton in 1949, when he was almost 18 years old, had a daughter in 1951, and divorced in 1957. Later that year, he married again and had another daughter. More than a decade after his first heinous act on children, Parnell was convicted of armed robbery in Utah. While imprisoned for this charge, his second wife filed for divorce. Parnell claimed to have married a 3rd time in 1968, but no record were ever found to substantiate this. In an interview with East Bay Express journalist Katie St. Clair in the year 2000, Parnell denied having been sexually abused, although Mike Eccles' book, I Know My First Name is Steven, claims that he was molested at the age of 13 by a porter in a rooming house that his mother owned in Bakersfield. Parnell died in prison at the age of 76 on January 21, 2008. After he was charged with his final crime. The story of Parnell's heinous acts on Steven Stayner formed the basis of a 1991 book by Mike Eccles. Prior to publication, the manuscript served as the basis for the 1989 TV miniseries I Know My First Name is Steven, also known as The Missing Years, with Arliss Howard as Parnell.
What's your name? What's his name?
Timmy White.
Is that right? Is that your name?
Yeah, Timmy White.
Hey, Bob, this here's Timmy White. Are you sure? Well, that's what he says, yeah. What are you doing with this boy?
I was taking him home.
Taking him home, huh?
I know my first name is Steven. I think my last name is Stayner.
Hulu made a Hulu original true crime documentary named Captive Audience, a real American horror story, which follows the story of Steven Stayner and what became of his captor, Kenneth Parnell. Parnell spent his life in and out of jail for different types of crimes: car theft, arson, armed robbery, kidnapping. Some sources include abuse, others rape of children. However, the focus of the story is on the crimes he committed against children. Throughout his life, Parnell committed 4 crimes against an unknown 8-year-old boy, which no source mentioned any details on him, and some don't even know it happened, because it was prior to the victim he is known for, Steven Stayner, his second victim. The third is Timothy White, and the fourth and last is non-existent. It was a police setup to catch him in the act. I'll be going through the details of what happened to each of the victims, plus what led to Parnell's arrest, his charges, and the punishment he received. Around 1951, in Bakersfield, California, Parnell lured an 8-year-old child using a deputy sheriff badge he bought at an Army-Navy surplus store, then kidnapped and molested the child. In a 15 January 2000 interview with East Bay Express journalist Katie St. Clair about what he did to the boy, Parnell said he kidnapped and molested the boy because his wife was pregnant and that he had to find another outlet. On the 1st of March 1951, he was arrested and charged with sodomizing a young boy, as well as for impersonating a police officer. He was convicted of the crime in 1952 and hence sentenced to almost 4 years in prison, whilst receiving treatment at a Norwalk State Hospital. He got a lock from a clothes room window and escaped staying free until February of the following year, when Parnell was finally apprehended in Albuquerque, New Mexico. What Parnell did to Steven is the reason why he is known, and the story made the basis of a book, a mini TV series, and in 2022, a true crime documentary made by Hulu. The best description of what happened comes from Ervin Murphy's confession, a co-worker at the Yosemite Lodge, where Parnell worked as a night auditor, plus Steven's testimony. And it goes as follows. In 1972, Ervin Murphy was working at a lodge in Yosemite National Park as a night janitor. In the fall, Parnell came to work at the lodge as a night auditor, and the two men became acquainted. Over the following weeks and months, the two became good friends, and soon Parnell confided to Murphy that he was lonesome and wanted to acquire a son. Parnell solicited Murphy's aid in picking up a child, and after some hesitation, Murphy agreed to help him. Murphy stated in his confession that Parnell gave no indication that he was intended to abuse the child sexually. He stated further that he never suspected that Parnell was in any way sexually deviant. Murphy was often described by those who knew him as naive, trusting, and a simple-minded man. Murphy's first couple of attempts to entice children into Parnell's car were unsuccessful. The children stated that they had to go home, and Murphy let them go. On December 4th, 1972, 7-year-old Steven Stayner was walking home from school in Merced when he was stopped by Murphy, who gave Steven some religious flyers and asked him if he wanted to make a donation to a church. When Steven said that his parents might want to make a donation, Murphy asked him if he wanted a ride home. At first, the boy refused, but after Murphy continued talking to him and again offered a ride, he accepted. At that point, Parnell pulled up his car and opened the door for Steven. Steven testified that he climbed in the back seat of the car. According to Murphy, the boy sat in front. Between the two men, Parnell drove towards Steven's house and then passed the road where the boy lived. When Steven remarked that they had passed his road, one of the two men told him that they would call his parents and ask if he might stay the night with them. Steven replied that they might go to his house and ask, but they kept on driving until they arrived at a trailer park in Catesville, about 20 miles from Merced. The two men took the boy to a rented cabin in which they had placed toys in anticipation of their successful abduction of a child.
What happened that afternoon? Do you remember when you were walking home from school?
Yes, I was walking home from school, and I was stopped by a man along the street just a few blocks from my house, and he asked me if I wanted to, me or my mother wanted to donate something to a church, and I had told him that my mother would probably want to, and so he offered me a ride home. I had refused the first time, telling him that my house is just a few blocks away, and he had asked me several more times, and after a while I had taken a ride. And then a car pulled up, and I got in, and they passed the road that I lived on. And I had told them that was the road I lived on. They said that we'll just call your parents to see if you can stay the night.
Were you afraid?
Not that much. I was a little bit.
The two men and Steven stayed in the cabin for a few nights, with Parnell and Steven sleeping in the cabin's one bed and Murphy sleeping on the couch. At that time, Parnell told Steven that he had gone to court and obtained custody of him. Some sources other than the confession suggest that the reason Steven was somewhat okay with that is Parnell telling him that his parents couldn't afford to keep him anymore, and a judge had given Parnell legal custody of him, and that his new name was Dennis. Steven stated, "I don't think I really knew what he meant," when Parnell told him he had been to court to obtain custody.
What did they tell you as the days went on, why they were keeping you with them, and what did they tell you about your family?
Well, the first night they had said they called my parents and said it was all right that I stayed the night. The second night they said that they had called them again and said that I could stay another night. Then one of them went out and came back and said that he went to court and got in possession of me and said that I was his.
How did you feel about that when you heard that?
I I really forgotten what I felt at that time. It was kind of a shock to me.
You called him, I've been told that you called him Dad. How long before you started calling him Dad? Do you have any idea when that started?
That started about a week after my abduction.
What were your thoughts during the 7 years about your parents? Did you think about them, and if so, what went through your mind?
Through the 7 years, I don't remember what went through my mind, but I thought of my parents very often.
The two men then took Steven to Yosemite National Park, to the lodge where they worked. When Murphy was unavailable, Parnell gave Steven sleeping pills so that he would sleep while Parnell was at work. Parnell also changed Steven's hair color so that he would not be recognized. In his confession, Murphy stated that he never saw any indication that Parnell was sexually abusing the child. Steven testified that he did not recall being sexually abused, either in Kathy's Valley or in Yosemite.
When Steven didn't make it home from school, his parents immediately were alerted.
Merced was the lead police department, and so they really mounted a large effort to search, and they searched, and there was just nothing there.
It happened here at this corner, and it was such a classic situation, the kind against which parents are constantly warning their children. The next morning, there was an empty desk in the second grade class at Charles Wright School.
After 2 or 3 weeks at the Yosemite Lodge, Parnell took Steven to live in Santa Rosa, leaving Murphy behind. Parnell told the boy that he was never to tell anyone his true identity and threatened to spank him if he did. Steven testified that one night, while living in Santa Rosa, he tried to leave Parnell by walking away from his house, but that he became frightened and turned back. The two remained in Santa Rosa for about 3 years, with Steven enrolled in school under the name Dennis Parnell. From Santa Rosa in 1975, Parnell took Steven to Willits, and a month later to Fort Bragg. When he was in 5th grade, in September of 1976, Parnell moved to Camchi in Mendocino County, where he and the boy lived for the next 3 years. In August 1979, Parnell moved to Manchester. Steven testified that soon after his arrival in Santa Rosa, Parnell began to commit sodomy upon his person and involved him in acts of oral copulation. Shortly before Steven's flight in 1980, Parnell was still committing these acts, although with less frequency.
A few weeks after he kidnapped Steven, Parnell pulled up stakes and he started drifting around California. They moved first to Santa Rosa. They would stay in flea bag motels, a crappy trailer, or a broken down house. Parnell and Steven ended up in the little town of Camchi, California, which is in Mendocino County.
Camchi was really tiny. It had maybe a post office and a general store. And he kept him on the grounds in a trailer.
So this is where Ken Parnell used to live many years ago. It's a good place to hide. It's a long ways from anywhere out here.
While Steven obtained Parnell's permission before leaving his presence, he nevertheless was outside of his control when he attended school, and while Parnell was at work, Steven was also often cared for by babysitters. In addition, he stayed overnight at homes of 2 friends a lot of times, and once with each of 2 other friends. While in the 6th grade, he and 60 other students stayed in San Francisco for a number of nights. By the time he was in high school, he was making out-of-town trips. As a member of a football team, Steven also had access to a bicycle. He made calls to friends, would often hitchhike from school to Parnell's residence, to movies, and to the homes of friends, and learned to drive Parnell's vehicle. He composed addresses and mailed letters without the knowledge of Parnell. In Fort Bragg, he was briefly in police custody when he was caught shoplifting, although he was once threatened with a spanking. Steven failed to mention actual physical restraint or punishment. He has a vague recollection of stating to Parnell that he wanted to return to Merced, but he does not recall Parnell's reply, if any. In addition, he never forgot his true name or the names of his parents. Even with this testimony, some sources suggest that Steven lived as Parnell's son for 7 years, during which he was repeatedly sexually abused. In addition, Steven later claimed that Parnell's attitude altered from severe beating to sometimes spoiling him.
You know, he was already smoking cigarettes. A lot of kids had freedom, but not his kind of come and go as he pleased, which makes me wonder, why didn't he just leave?
As Steven got older and entered puberty, Parnell's sexual interest in Steven waned, and Parnell sought a new boy, which leads us to the story of his third victim, 5-year-old Timothy White.
Ken Parnell takes Steven to this small little town called Manchester, kind of along the coast of Northern California.
Ken is looking for another prepubescent boy. Steven knew what was going to happen, and Steven knew that that was wrong.
And he was going to end that.
What Steven would do in response would make him world famous.
In 1980, Parnell attempted another kidnapping with his mistress Barbara Matthias, but that failed to go to plan. He also conscripted Steven into aiding him in the kidnapping, but Steven had always failed to grab the targeted child, to the point that Parnell stopped using Steven as an accomplice, berating him for being incompetent. Years later, in an interview, Steven admitted to intentionally sabotaging the kidnapping. On February 14, 1980, Steven returned to Parnell's residence in Manchester to find that Parnell had abducted 5-year-old Timothy White, with some sources suggesting that John Portman, a minor and an acquaintance of Steven's, had helped him, and other sources adding that the boys suffered abuse on the hands of Parnell for a while. One night, on the 1st of March 1980, while Parnell was at work, the boys hitchhiked from the cabin near Manchester, 40 miles to Ukiah, California. Steven coached Timmy on how to enter the police station to turn himself in, led him to the door, and then walked away. Timmy, however, became frightened and ran after Steven. Police officers saw the young boy run off, and radio patrol cars intercepted the two about a block from the station. When asked to identify himself, Steven replied, "Steven Stayner." He did not identify Parnell until after some amount of coaxing by police officers. The exhaustive source of missing child posters and a piecemeal interrogation confirmed that Steven was a missing child as well. By daybreak the following morning, Parnell had been arrested while investigators were checking into Parnell's past. The 1952 conviction came to light. Steven testified that prior to Timmy's abduction, he had thought of leaving Parnell and had made plans to do so. He stated that he often wanted to return to his parents in Merced, and added that he did not want the boy to suffer the abuse that he had endured. Parnell was charged for kidnapping Steven and Timothy, but not for the sexual abuse. He pleaded not guilty, but was convicted of both kidnappings and served 5 years of his 7 years prison sentence. Edward Murphy, Parnell's accomplice from the Stevens kidnapping, was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment and paroled after 2 years. John Portman, Stayner's school friend, who helped Parnell in the Timothy's kidnapping, was sentenced to a term of juvenile work camp. Barbara Matthias, Parnell's girlfriend, who lived with him and Steven for some time, was never charged with any violation and cooperated with authorities in Parnell's trial. In a tragic turn of events, Steven later died in a motorcycle accident in 1989. Steven's older brother, Kerry Stayner, who worked as a motel handyman, was sentenced to death for killing 3 tourists, a Yosemite Park naturalist, in 1999. Timothy White, a sheriff deputy, at the age of 35 died of a pulmonary embolism, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. Through the year 2002, Parnell tried to coerce his caregiver into buying him a 4-year-old boy. At the time, he was 71 years old and in poor health, suffering from diabetes, emphysema, plus others, brought on by a stroke that he had suffered, which made him require near 24 hours a day nursing care in his cluttered apartment in 2600 block of Matthews Street in Berkeley. His caregiver, Diane Stevens, was aware of Parnell's past and cooperated with police in setting up a sting operation that would lead to his arrest. According to Diane Stevens' testimony, Parnell requested that the child have a clean rectum, indicating sexual intention. He paid $100 for a birth certificate and had $400 on his person for the completion of the transaction when he was to receive the child. On January 3, 2003, Parnell was arrested that day, subsequently telling authorities and wanted a family. In a 2003 jailhouse interview with the Chronicle, Parnell admitted that he had tried to buy the boy to experience the love and respect that a son has for a father. He said he had no intention of harming the boy. "Time is running out on me," said Parnell, who was 71 at the time. Parnell said he had hoped to raise a family by arranging to buy a boy and a girl. He said he sought the love of children because he had not had any luck with women, and also said it was not wrong to buy a child because there has been other cultures that have been doing that. Parnell said he did not care if people did not like him. Parnell's defense lawyer remembered him as an easy, agreeable client who realized that his legal defense was difficult because his voice had been secretly recorded while he was attempting to buy the child. Parnell was convicted on February 9, 2004 on the charges of attempting to purchase a child and attempted child molestation, even though no child had been targeted, meaning the victim was non-existent. The prosecution successfully argued that sexual aids and pornography found in the apartment along with the caregiver Diane's own testimony were enough evidence to prove that Parnell's intentions were criminal in nature. Parnell was sentenced to 25 years to life under California's three strikes law. Prosecutor Tim Wellman had largely argued his case before the jury by showing a slideshow of Stayner Mark I, White Mark II, and a blank screen Mark III to show how the non-existent child that would have been abducted had police not been notified. Wellman said Parnell was looking for one last Steven Stayner, one last Timothy White. He has been a danger to children his entire life. On January 21, 2008, according to the prison officials at California State Prison Hospital in Vacaville, Parnell died of natural causes. He was under medical care for some time. The case of Kenneth Parnell provides a window into the sick mind of an individual who hid under the cover of loneliness and just wanting to have a family. Kenneth Parnell's death brings to a close his long criminal history of violating young children.